Chapter 7 of 1/3 Off. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Brian Ness. 1/3 Off by Irvin S. Cobb. Chapter 7. Office Visits, $10. It required all of 2 weeks of experimenting with my interior to convince me that whatever it might be that annoyed me, it surely was not a thing which an intensive bombardment of the liver would cure. The liver has a low visibility, but it is easy to hit. I had the aversion to seeking professional guidance for the curing of a presumably minor disorder that most robust male adults have. In personal tribute I may add that I have never been hypochondriac in any possible respect. However, toward the end of those 3 weeks, I formed the decision that I would go to see a doctor or so. But I would sneak up on these gentlemen, so to speak. I would call upon them in the role of a friend rather than avowedly as a prospective patient, and take them into my confidence, as it were, by degrees. Somewhere in the back part of my brain I nursed a persistent fear that my complaints might be diagnosed as symptoms of that incurable malady known as being 44 years old, going on 45. And I knew that much already, without paying a physician $25 for telling me so the first time and $10 for each time he told it to me over again. Rather shamefacedly, with a well-simulated air of casualness, I dropped in upon a physician who is a friend of mine and in whose judgment I have confidence, and then, after a 2-day interval, I went to see a second physician of my acquaintance who, I believe, also thoroughly knows his trade. With both men I followed the same tactics: roundabout chatting on the topic of this or that, and finally an honest confession as to the real purpose of my visit. In both instances the results were practically identical. Each man manifested an almost morbid curiosity touching on my personal habits and bodily idiosyncrasies. Each asked me a lot of questions. Each went at me with X-ray machines and blood tests and chemical analyses, if there isn't any such word. I claim there should be, until my being was practically an open book to him, and I had no secrets left at all. And the upshot of all this was that each of them told me that though organically I was as sound as a nut, in fact much sounder than some of the nuts they knew professionally, I was carrying an overload of avoirdupois about me. In other words, I was too fat for my own good. I was eating too much sweet stuff and entirely too much starch, especially starch. They agreed on this point emphatically. As well as I could gather, I was subjecting my interior to that highly shellacked gloss which is peculiar to the bosom of the old-fashioned full dress or burying shirt upon its return from the steam laundry, when what my system really called for was the dull domestic finish. "Well, Doc," I said, upon hearing this for the second time in language which already had a familiar sound, "well, all that you say being true, what then?" "For one thing, more exercise." "But I take plenty of exercise now." "For example, what?" "For example, golf." "How often do you play golf?" "Well, not so very often as the real golf bug or caddie's worm would measure the thing, say on an average of once a week in the golfing season, but I take so many swings at the ball before hitting it that I figure I get more exercise out of the game than do those who play oftener, but take only about one wallop at the pill in driving off. And when I drive into the deep grass, as is my wont, my work with the niblick would make you think of somebody bailing out a sinking boat. My bunker exercises are frequently what you might call violent. And in the fall of the year I do a lot of tramping about in the woods with a gun. I might add that on a hunting trip I can walk many a skinny person into a state of total exhaustion. I stated this last pridefully. "All right, then," he said, "we'll concede that. You get an abundance of exercise. Then there is another thing you should do, and of the two this is by far the more essential. You should go on a diet." Right there I turned mentally rebellious. I wanted to reduce my bulk, but I did not want to reduce my provender. I offered counter-arguments in defense. I pointed but that for perhaps 5 years past my weight practically had been stationary. Also I called attention to the fact that I no longer ate so heavily as once I had. Not that I wished actually to decry my appetite. It had been a good friend to me, and not for worlds would I slander it. I have a sincere conviction that age cannot wither nor custom stale my infinite gastric juices. Never, I trust, will there come a time when I shan't relish my victuals, or when I'll feel disinclined to chase the last fugitive bite around and around the plate until I overtake it. But I presented the claim, which was quite true, that I was not the consumer, measured by volume, I once had been. Perhaps my freighterage spaces with passing years had grown less expansive or less accommodating or something. Likewise, I invited his consideration of the fact, which was not to be gainsaid either, that many men very much less elaborated than I in girth customarily ate very much more than I did. I recalled offhand sundry conspicuous examples of this sort. I believe I mentioned one or two such. For instance, now, there was Mr. William Jennings Bryan. The Bryan appetite, as I remarked to the doctor, is one of the chief landmarks of Mr. Bryan's home city of Lincoln, Nebraska. They take the sight-seeing tourists around to have a look at it the first thing. To observe Mr. Bryan breakfasting on the morning when a National Democratic Convention is in session is a sight worth seeing. A double order of cantaloupes on the half shell, a derby hat full of oatmeal, a rosary of sausages, and about as many flapjacks as would be required to tessellate the floor of a fair-sized reception hall is nothing at all for him. And when he has concluded his meal, he gets briskly up and strolls around to the convention hall and makes a better speech, and a longer one, and a louder pile than anybody. Naturally, time, the insatiable remodeler, has worked some outward changes in Mr. Bryan since the brave old days of the cross of gold. His hair, chafed by the constant pressure of the halo, has retreated up and ever up his scalp until the forehead extends clear over and down upon the sunset slope. The little fine wrinkles are thickly smocked at the corners of the eagle eyes that flashed so fiercely at the cringing plutocrats. But his bearing is just as graceful, and his voice just as silvery and as strong as when in '96 he advocated free silver to save the race, or when he advocated anti-expansion in the Philippines, or government ownership of the railroads, or a policy of non-preparedness for war when Germany first began acting up. Grover Cleveland de Bergdahl felt the same way about it, and so did Ma Bergdahl. And I, for one, have no doubt that Mr. Bryan will be just as supple mentally and physically 3 years hence, when, if he runs true to form, he will be advocating yet another of that series of those immemorial Jeffersonian principles of the fathers which he thinks up to order right out of his own head when a campaign impends. Mr. Bryan knows how to play the political game, none better, but he certainly does have a large discard. That, however, is aside from the main issue. The point I sought to bring out there in the office of my friend Dr. So-and-so was that Mr. Bryan, to my knowledge, ate what he craved and all that he craved, yet did not become obese. When the occasion demanded, he could be amply bellicose, but the accent was not upon the first two syllables. I cited similar cases, further to buttress my position. I told him that almost the skinniest human being I ever knew had been one of the largest eaters. I was speaking now of John Wesley Bass, the champion raw egg-eater of Massac Precinct, whose triumphant career knew not pause or discomfiture until one day at the McCracken County Fair, when suddenly tragedy dire impended. He did not overextend himself in the gustatory line. That, to one of John Wesley Bass's natural gifts and attainments, well nigh would have been impossible. But he betrayed a lack of caution when, having broken his former record by eating 36 raw eggs at a sitting, he climbed upon a steam merry-go-round shortly thereafter, falling off the spotted wooden giraffe which he rode, and being removed to the city hospital in an unconscious condition. That night later, when the crisis had passed, the doctor said that, as nearly as they could figure out a case so unusual, Mr. Bass had had a very close call from being just naturally scrambled to death. I spoke at length of my former fellow townsman's powers, dwelling heavily upon the fact that, despite all, he never thickened up at the waistline. Throughout the narrative, however, the doctor punctuated my periods with derisive snorts, which were disconcerting to an orderly presentation of the facts. Nevertheless, I continued until I had reached what I regarded as a telling climax. "Piffle," he rejoined. "One hoarse, raucous piffle, and 3 sharp, decisive puffs for your arguments. I tell you that what ails you is this: you are now registering the preliminary warnings of obesity. The danger is not actually here yet, but for you nature already has set the danger signals. There's a red light on the switch for one I. Cobb. You are due before a great while for a head-end collision with your own health. You can take my